So I want to talk a bit about the Harlem Renaissance, and the best way to sort of characterize it is as an intellectual, social, and artistic explosion among African Americans that took place in Harlem between the end of World War I and the beginning of the Depression in 1929, with the 20s being the height of what we typically refer to as the Harlem Renaissance. So let's just start with locating where this particular area is geographically. So Harlem is in New York State. So here you see New York State here. And Harlem is part of New York City. And New York City has 5 boroughs, and Harlem is part of Manhattan specifically. And you can see where we have Harlem up here, East Harlem, and then the different areas in Harlem. So this is where it's located. So it's a tiny community, relatively speaking, in New York City. So to give a little background about the Harlem Renaissance and how it came to be, we need to back up a little bit. So the Civil War in the United States ends in 1865, and Reconstruction in the South begins. And so then we had the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery, and the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed African Americans civil rights. Unfortunately, as you know, many southern states looked to limit these rights and created separate facilities for African Americans. In 1896, in the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson, which is quite a famous one, this decision basically stated that separate facilities, so long as they were equal to those of whites, were constitutionally protected. And so this court ruling began the era of separate but equal, and we all know that wasn't really the case, as the Jim Crow South segregated Black and white Americans more than they'd ever been segregated before. So as a result of Plessy versus Ferguson, this so-called separate but equal that truly wasn't, and the discrimination bred by Jim Crow laws, many African Americans chose to move north in search of a better life. And approximately 1.6 million African Americans moved from rural southern areas to urban northeast areas like Harlem. And this great migration occurred between 1916 and 1930. So about this time period we're discussing. And just so that you know, a second migration occurred after the Depression to areas that went west, the Midwest and West. So as a result of this great migration, we had the development of Harlem. And Harlem was originally an exclusive suburb for the white middle class. Had very stately houses, polo grounds, an opera house. So it was a cultural center from its inception. It then became a destination for European immigrants. So as Irish and Italian immigrants, Russian immigrants came to the United States, they settled in Harlem. And so what happened was many of the white middle class people who had lived there continued to move on further north. With the Great Migration, many African Americans flocked to Harlem, and this really affected two groups. So you had two main groups flocking to Harlem. People searching for work from the South. So as people were leaving the oppression of the Jim Crow South, they came, looked for work, and settled there. And then an educated middle class who made Harlem a cultural center again. And so this educated middle class was also made up of African Americans. So both of these groups, people searching for work, and then this educated class, descended on Harlem at the same time. And so it became a bustling community in New York, and it still is today. So while the Harlem Renaissance was never really a school per se, they didn't have a unified creed, and there were many voices, many leading figures involved. And so you can't really say, well, they had one goal, because the goal was many, but there were a couple of beliefs or assertions that people living in and around Harlem and promoting the arts during this time believed a couple of things. One, America had to include Black voices in order to fully define itself. So in other words, America would only be whole by including Black voices in its art, in its literature, in its daily life. So this was a step that America had to take. And then second, artistic creativity, and this is where the Renaissance really comes in, was essential to Black Americans' realization and assertion of their full humanity in the U.S. So in other words, creativity had to be recognized. Black artists, Black poets, Black writers of all types, musicians had to be recognized if they were going to find their full human identity. And so these were some of the goals, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it, of the Harlem Renaissance. Even though there were many figures and many artists going about these goals in various ways. So the Harlem Renaissance had a large impact on mainstream culture. And so one of those was as America began to embrace Harlem culture and recognize the African American experience as conveyed very complex emotions and really touched all of humanity. As this occurred, these new works rejected typical stereotypes. So what happened was a larger recognition of African American culture. The Negro was in vogue, basically, wrote Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes was one of the leading figures of the Harlem Renaissance. And as this occurred, white society accepted new African American music, especially jazz, art, and literature. Zora Neale Hurston, another leading figure of the Harlem Renaissance, referred to white supporters and patrons as Negrotarians, and this was a very nuanced term. In other words, there was a question about whether maybe the white participation in the Harlem Renaissance was exploitative, if it was patronizing and paternalistic, or if it was a sincere collaboration. And I believe, as Hurston did, that it was all of those things. So some white American participation was exploitative and patronizing, yet other types of white participation were actually sincerely collaborative and interested in bringing these new voices into the mainstream. Another impact of the Harlem Renaissance was the development of a new consciousness for Black Americans. So W.E.B. Du Bois basically posed this whole idea, and we will read about him. He was a leading figure as well of the Renaissance. Raised this idea of the double consciousness. And that basically, according to Du Bois, Black Americans lived inside of this double consciousness. In other words, a two-ness at the same time. So for Du Bois, and what he was trying to put forth here is that African Americans were both American and had a Black cultural history that was rich. And so how did those two things get combined and worked out? Because he believed that there were like two souls within one person, two thoughts within one person, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals. In other words, what does it mean to be Black and American, particularly during this time period? And so these were questions that the Renaissance raised. You can also see anger, resentment, conflict, and energy, sensitivity, and high ideals within these writers and artists and musicians. So it wasn't an either or, it was a both and that you will see in their work. And then ultimately, it was the Harlem Renaissance and this focus on Black consciousness and Black participation in mainstream America that had never happened before that was ultimately going to pave the way for the civil rights movement of the 60s. So as we begin to explore the works of these writers, and particularly, I want you to keep these things in mind. Like what is important about this Renaissance, and what are these writers trying to show us and make us think about through their work.